Let's go live, and we are live. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another evening segment here on Weather Center Nazario. It is 7:15 p.m. I just got in from the studio a little while ago. I was on the road for a little over an hour now, and I figured, you know what, I was in a very heated debate with myself as to whether or not I wanted to do a live discussion tonight, because there's enough to discuss, but nothing really concerning to discuss. We're just talking trends, a little bit of that consistency out there, and looking at a fairly cluttered tropical Atlantic AOR here, looking at the National Hurricane Center's homepage. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me this evening. I'm News 6 meteorologist David Nazario, back with a tropical update to talk to you a little bit about the peak of the hurricane season that we are getting ready to wander into over the next 6 to 7 days. As you can see here, we do have 4 areas of tropical activity that are being monitored by the National Hurricane Center, all of which, as the description of this live stream implies, they are fairly low in confidence. There really isn't anything right on the verge of developing, nor do we have anything that is expected to develop over the next 48 to 72 hours. In my personal and professional opinion, it's going to be these 2 that we need to watch, and there's been a lot of very weird information all over the social media platforms, YouTube, X, Instagram, TikTok, you name it, about this feature down here. I'm going to try to dispel that just a little bit and talk you through it, what it is that I'm seeing with this, and why it could be a potential rainmaker and a flood issue for a lot of us along the Gulf coastline, but nothing in terms of a major hurricane threat that I've seen others promoting for an extended period of time at this point. We have this new feature up here, and I'll go ahead and kind of go over top the percentages here. For our newest feature, highlighted as Disturbance 1, I would personally call this Disturbance number 4. This was added earlier this afternoon to the 2 o'clock update, 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. 48 hours, a 10% chance of development. 7 days, a 20% chance of development. And I'm at a bit of a loss as to why National Hurricane Center has highlighted this. If you read the very brief discussion here, they specifically mention a non-tropical area of low pressure. Now, I know that we're approaching the peak of the hurricane season, and we may have to get our numbers up just a little bit, and we're going to talk a little bit about it, the potential limitations that we're seeing, unfortunately, just ramping up exponentially against the tropical Atlantic basin, preventing us from a lot of activity from popping off. And as you can see, I'll move the cursor away just a little bit. This is technically the hurricane season, despite the fact that we're looking at very low developmental odds, which each of these 4 disturbances out there, however you want to describe them, are furthest west, being that monsoonal tropical mess of disorganized showers and thunderstorms just to the immediate south of Jamaica. This was an area that actually had a ton, and we're talking a tremendous amount of upper confidence from not only our ensembles, but even our deterministic models all across every platform, from the GFS to the European model, the German model, the Canadian model, the Korean model, the UK model, the Chinese model, the Australian model, the Navy model, you name it. Every model had this developing, and unfortunately it has lost a lot of its luster. We're at an 0 for 30 split right now, 0% chance over the next 48 hours, 30% chance over the next 7 days. This is likely to still produce heavy amounts of rainfall and potential flood conditions for Belize, the Yucatan, parts of El Salvador, Honduras, and areas of Guatemala on the southern periphery of it. In the Bay of Campeche, we have a pretty decent front range and Great Plains cold plunge that is going to come down and grab some of this energy, as well as nudge that piece of disturbed weather that's been marinating along the eastern coastline of Texas down towards the south. And I'm seeing all kinds of really weird discussions and theories as to what's going to happen here. Once again, I'm going to try to alleviate as much confusion as possible and get my best interpretation of what's going to happen and what the most likely outcome will look like. There will be storms, there will be rain, but I'm not seeing a hurricane, let alone a major hurricane, out of what would typically produce what we would call homegrown slop. at the tail end of a frontal boundary, a stationary front that's going to be out there. These two, to wrap up on National Hurricane Center's homepage, do seem to poise the greatest shot at development over the next 7 days. The next 7 to 10 days, if that. Particularly, this one is going to come and make a very close call to our friends in the Greater Antilles, the Turks and Caicos, and the Bahamas, before getting shot right back out to sea before it can make a run on the mainland United States, either as an area of disorganized tropical showers and thunderstorms, or maybe a tropical depression as it moves through the Bahamas. Then this backside feature, as well as another one that I'm monitoring that's going to be coming off the coast of Africa, does have a pretty decent shot at developing, and we're going to get right into that. So first and foremost, let's look at our half-disc shot, because right from the jump start, in my absence from the YouTube channel, I've been hearing a lot of folks mentioning dry air, dry air, dry air, the season's over, the season's over. The dry air really isn't an issue. The dry air is far from an issue. So if we're going to cancel the hurricane season, if we're going to more or less hype in the opposite direction that there's never going to be another named storm again for the rest of 2024, let's at least get it right. And so with that being said, I have the mid-level water vapor pulled up for us. And right now, this is what's going to give us a good interpretation and a good idea of where a lot of our deep layer moisture is across the Atlantic. And right out of the gate, I'm sure you guys see that there really isn't a bunch of very dense and pungent dry air across the spectrum, from the coast to Africa, especially all the way as far west as the Gulf of Mexico and the central and western Caribbean. So that is not the issue. I'm still seeing Saharan dust thrown around. Saharan dust is not a problem. The Saharan dust, in fact, is pretty much entirely over. We have seen the conclusion of Saharan dust season, if you will, back towards the last second and the final week, or the second to last and the final week of August. And now we're finally realizing that Saharan dust is pretty much no more. It is non-existent across the Atlantic basin. We do still have some dry air in affiliation with that anticyclonic wave breaking that I've briefed you guys on in previous updates and previous live streams, that just continues to come down towards the south and west along the western periphery of Europe and down towards the northwest quadrant of Africa. So it may seem like Saharan dust, but it's actually continental dry air that is not only being force-fed from the mid-latitudes as those waves crash and break, as the name implies, but it's also being fed out into the Atlantic, in part by the typical steering currents that would push the Saharan dust out there. The portions of Africa that would typically produce the dust are moist. They are experiencing what some are, coining it as the 1,000-year flood. We have had extremely anomalous high levels of precipitation across Africa, especially over the equatorial areas of Africa, and I believe that's in part what's creating that Atlantic La Nina, that cool pool along the southern hemispheric portion of the equatorial Atlantic waters. I'll show you the sea surface temp anomaly chart towards the back end of this brief, but I do think a lot of the thunderstorm and the rainfall activity is what's helping to enhance that easterly wind gradient and create what we would typically see in the eastern Pacific, upwelling the waters and pushing the La Nina in. We're seeing it in the Atlantic southern hemisphere, and that's what's also producing a large cool bubble on the south side of the equator. But working west to east, we have lots of moisture out there, guys. There's plenty of moisture to go around. The dust is not an issue. The dry air really isn't an issue. I saw someone was briefing this feature down here. Lots of good thunderstorm activity, but the instability just isn't there. The vorticity just isn't there with this thing. It's wandering over tremendous ocean heat content. It's wandering over wonderful hot sea surface temps. And the unfortunate nature of the beast is we still have wave breaking going on right in through here. So we have a positive vorticity streamer. You can kind of see right in through here. We have a deep trough extending over the eastern half of the United States, supporting our frontal system that's draped all the way from Atlantic Canada through down to the southern plains, the border of Texas and Mexico, supporting our thunderstorm activity out here in the Sunshine State and along the immediate upper Gulf coastline from Texas through to Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. So with that being said, dry air, non-issue. Moisture is definitely readily apparent. We just have a little bit too much in the shear department, and our tuts as well as our wave breaking just continues to produce too much, or I should say extensive amounts of wind shear that is just not conducive for tropical activity. That's why I really don't think this leading system is going to have a fighting chance. The one back behind it may not have too much of a fighting chance, but beyond that, we could see a very quick spin up before that thing ejects up and out to sea, kind of like what Margot did last year. Here's a quick look at the Saharan dust. As you can see, no problem at all whatsoever. There's almost no dust. None whatsoever. You go to the back end of it, and it's like, where's the dust? I keep hearing Saharan dust. David, where's the dust? Everyone else is talking dust. Why are you not talking about the dust? Well, because it's not there. The dust is not an issue. If I rewind the clock and we go all the way back to, we won't even go that far. We'll go maybe about a little over 10 days. You go to the 25th of August, and look at the massive difference. We have plenty of dry, dusty air to combine with the wave breaking, the shear, and the continental dry air coming off of Africa and Europe. And that's a recipe for tropical disaster. And when I say that, I mean our cyclones are not going to have a chance. The waves are going to be suppressed. Coming off at the high latitude that they did, they were right in the heart of that continental dry air and the Saharan dust that was still around. If I go back to the 4th at 0Z, nothing, nada, zilch. So we are pretty good out there in the dust department. Here's a look at our blend of model probabilities. Still seeing some signs that something may try to manifest itself in the western Gulf of Mexico, whether it be with that sliver of energy that's going to cross the Yucatan into the Bay of Campeche, or that disturbance that was previously highlighted by National Hurricane Center that's going to be nudged ever so slightly off towards the south along the immediate periphery of that cold frontal boundary that will reinforce the stationary tail, that very thin, weak band of temperature discontinuity that is still present over the northern Gulf of Mexico. If you fast forward right about there, you can already see we have a whopping 90 to 95% probability that there will be some sort of a tropical entity immediately exiting Africa and then boomeranging off into the North Atlantic, posing no issue to anybody outside of shipping interests, disturbing the fish at play, the dolphins that may be trying to break water, and the whales shooting the water up out of their blowholes for all intents and purposes. Might be an issue for the Azores way down the road if that thing can hold together, but regardless, not seeing too much in terms of anything else just yet. Here's a look at our ensembles, and there's a couple of areas I want you to pay close attention to. It's that first one in the Bay of Campeche that's going to launch due north according to our European ensembles, and we more or less continue to see somewhat of a marathon of low pressure ejecting out of the west and the southwest Gulf of Mexico. It's very bizarre. It is, but it isn't. Because at the same time, our upper air pattern supports this, and I have a working theory that this may not entirely be tropical. If you recall, October of last year, we were highlighting the potential for tropical development out of that same general source region, and we ended up experiencing an overnight tornado outbreak here in the state of Florida as a result of one of those subtropical areas of low pressure. We are expecting a little bit of a below average downward tick in our eastern United States temperatures, and as a result, we have a digging polar front jet, a mid-latitude trough that's going to come down and make its way as far south as the Gulf of Mexico, the southern plains, and the southeast United States. So as a result, I don't really anticipate that anything coming out of the Gulf is going to be bona fide tropical. We could see subtropical, or we could just simply see a stable wave go unstable, pick up frontal and jet support as it moves across the southeast, and could be a potential flood maker as we go down over the next 7 to 10 days, as well as what could possibly take shape as a deluge type of setup, a marathon of heavy rainfall for much of Florida, the Gulf coastline from Louisiana through to the Florida Panhandle, the Big Bend, and even extending up into Georgia and South Carolina. Where I also want to bring you in is going to be out here in the MDR. So naturally, ensembles are going to be the key for looking long range. You don't want to use deterministic models. I've fallen victim time and time again to using deterministic models down the road beyond 100, 200 hours. That's a big no-no for me, and I'll admit that. Sometimes I get a little carried away and I get a little overzealous, especially during these dead periods. Not going to be a mistake I make ever again. This hurricane season is teaching me a number of lessons, and I'm very thankful for that. The quiet period has done me wonders in terms of how I've improved my forecasting processes, especially now that I'm a part of the WKMG team. I'm sure a lot of you guys who've been following the page since last year will probably pick up on some of these tendencies. So I'm noticing a bit of a subtle uptick as we go beyond the back end of the middle portions of September. And I know that there's a lot of memes, a lot of issues, a lot of roasting going on across the social media platforms about the whole give it another 2 weeks. Truthfully, and I was talking to Jonathan Kagas about this today, there is a reason we do say give it another 2-ish or so weeks, and that's typically because we're looking for that intra-seasonal forcing to help give us that extra friendly nudge to possibly get a couple of these disturbances, or at least a singular tropical wave, tropical disturbance out there across the Atlantic AOR to get going. So that's kind of where that infamous phrase of give it another 2 weeks came from, as either a Kelvin wave, an area of wind shear, a tut, a wave-breaking positive vorticity streamer can finally get up out of there and allow something to maybe get its act together. That's more or less where that came from, just a friendly little tidbit. So I'm noticing a bit of an uptick in the signal as we get beyond the 10-day mark, so we're just going to keep an eye on it. We're just going to continue to monitor to see if this signal goes up and up, or if this crashes and burns as soon as we go to bed tonight and take a look at the 0Z ensembles. You can see the GEFS, the GFS ensemble suite, is also picking up on the same thing. Not as friendly with that system in the Gulf. It has one random ensemble member that goes major hurricane. Very unlikely, very, very low potential that actually takes place given the setup. We have a lot of jet-induced wind shear. We have cool, dry air coming out of the United States over the plains, the Midwest, the Ohio, Mississippi valleys, just continuing to dig south with that next upcoming trough. We're not going to be in a very friendly environment for something major, let alone anything hurricane strength to kick off. If we do see a bona fide low pressure come together, we might being the kicker here, folks, be somewhere in the low to mid-range tropical storm level intensity if it does get its act together. Then across the actual main development region of the Atlantic, you can see a number of our ensemble members do pick up on some features trying to get their act together, again, beyond the 10-15 day mark, so we're just monitoring. We're just going to watch the trends, see if we can build some confidence, and see exactly what's on the horizon, because things do look promising for the back end of September and the first half of October. I am highlighting an area that we'll talk about here in a moment. Here's a quick glance at our latest 12Z European model. There are some signatures out there. You can see one. What just happened there? Wow, what's going on here? Okay, anyways, I'm not too sure what just happened there. Apologies, I really can't tell you. I don't know if it's affecting you guys on your end, but just had a random technical difficulty for some strange reason. Anyways, looking at our latest 850 millibar vorticity brought to us by the Euro, there are a couple of features out there worth mentioning. This is going to be that disturbance number 1 off the mid-Atlantic and the northeast coastline. Still having a hard time wrapping my mind around National Hurricane Center stamping this, especially highlighting and designating it as a non-tropical area of low pressure. It's got fronts attached to it. It's got cool air advection on the backside of it, warm air advection going on out ahead of it from out of the tropics. So I don't know. It could possibly have a small window of opportunity to break away from the front, consolidate into a tighter cluster of that mid to low level vorticity, and try to take on tropical characteristics over the next 3 to 5 days. If it were to try to manifest itself into a tropical system, it would have to do it quick, because eventually we're going to get caught up in that trough axis that's moving through Quebec, Ontario, the Great Lakes, and we are definitely going to squash this feature's ability at becoming anything tropical. We have that vorticity signature that's down near the Lesser Antilles, the Leeward Islands. Not expecting too much in the way of development out of that, just noticing that there was a slight uptick on our 12Z data as you get out to about the 7-day mark. A little bit of a flare-up in its spinach, its rotation in that cyclonic core of its own, just to the north of the Bahamas, but just along the front end of this, you can see that frontal tail still entrained across the eastern seaboard, right over top Bermuda almost, just off to their northwest. That's going to block this thing, produce a ton of detrimental conditions for it: wind shear, dry air, cool advection, that temperature gradient that barotropic tropical cyclones do not like. And it's going to essentially bounce off that force field and go up and out to sea, becoming nothing more than a mere remnant low, if that, as it begins to pick up that jet support. You can see it right there blossoming up into a next major frontal system. This is definitely not tropical. I've also been seeing a few people mentioning that this is tropical. That is as frontal as you can get, ladies and gentlemen. You have a low here, a wave there. There's your low, there's your warm sector, a little bit of cool, maybe stationary boundary there, a little bit of warm, cool up there. That is most definitely a bona fide frontal system. And if I switch right over to the 200 millibar winds, there you have it. You can see purely jet supported with that deep digging, positively tilted trough extending down into the Gulf of Mexico. So I don't really see anything tropical, at least close to home just yet. Our focus should still be out near the African coast, the Cabo Verdes, to see when it is that our atmosphere will become a little bit more conducive for this parade of waves to come off Africa and help us out, or I should say help bolster the named storm so we can get off CSU and NOAA's backs a little bit. I have been looking downrange, and you can see that there is a trough extending down along the Europe coastline, particularly Spain and Portugal at the top portion of the chart here, the northwest quadrant of Africa. That trough is expected to eject. You can see how one of our tropical waves literally gets ejected all the way up to the north coastline of Africa and up towards Europe. So they actually have a tropical wave that tries to organize and then completely retrograde along the northern periphery of an anticyclone over North Africa, moving through the Mediterranean area, which is very weird, but you know what? It's been a very weird setup. It's been a very weird season, so to speak. We do have a couple of systems. There goes that next one right there, coming off of Africa, that does show a promising sign of maybe trying to steal the name Francine, maybe not. We've seen these rapid fluctuations and these dramatic shifts in model data. This isn't too far out to be unrealistic, so we're just going to continue to monitor the blend of probabilities, look at our ensemble plots, and see exactly whether or not our deterministic models hold on to this. This is echoed on the GFS. The Euro is identifying it. It has been for about a 36-hour window per model-to-model run that go all the way out to the 10-day mark. And then beyond that, you can finally more or less get a glance at a bit of a return to normalcy. There's a wave here exiting Africa right around that 10-degree latitude line, and then a wave back behind it as well, trying to float off the Horn of Africa there, just along where we would typically see these disturbances wandering around the ITCZ, that tropical convergence zone that we have definitely briefed plenty of different times. Here's a look at the wind shear. This is what I'd mentioned, guys. So there's that anticyclonic wave break right there. You can see that TUT, that trough axis, that's just right out in front of that first AOI that's leading the charge out of the main development region of the Atlantic. It's going to get ripped to pieces. I really do not see that thing developing too hostile of an environment out ahead of it, and it's just going to ride the periphery of that TUT, that trough axis that's going to continue to work its way off towards the west. That's going to help to intensify the negative conditions for that wave that was initially highlighted to develop. Everyone was talking major hurricane for the Caribbean, for the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of folks definitely misconstrued my own words talking about, we know the end of this movie. We do. And at the time, we were looking at a synoptic pattern and still are looking at a synoptic pattern that could put the East Gulf of Mexico, and particularly the state of Florida, under the threshold and in the microscope of an approaching tropical cyclone. And I made sure to defend myself and say, if we were to see development, if this feature does get going, it would be something that we need to monitor. So I don't know why the wordplay was necessary or people meant to manipulate the terminology, but either way, that's neither here nor there. We have too hostile of an environment on the western side of our AOR, and you can see just tremendous amounts of jet energy working along the eastern seaboard of the U.S. and across the deep south, the southeast United States, running almost west to east from Mexico, Texas, through to the Carolinas and out across into a nice difluent quadrant just to the west of Bermuda. Here's a look at the simulated water vapor satellite shot. So I don't bring this up enough, but this is actually a very valuable tool to determine whether or not your system has enough convection to possibly spin up into a named feature. So as you go through time, you can see we do have some fairly healthy waves that are eventually going to come off of Africa as we go beyond the 7-day mark. Beyond the 7-day mark, and then finally we're going to see a return to form where those African easterly waves are finally going to start to come off at a bit more of that favorable latitude range from about 10 to 13, maybe getting up towards the 15 degrees north latitude line. Even that has been proven to be a little too far to the north, running into a lot of that dry air impediment that's coming off of northwest Africa and continental Europe, brought down by the trough axes that's been marinating over that neck of the woods, as well as those waves crashing over the top of our subtropical high pressure in the Atlantic. So slowly but surely, continuing to see them lining up like bowling pins. It's just a matter of the background state of the environment actually cooperating with us. And with that being said, here's a look at what Dr. Philip Klotzbach from CSU has mentioned. And this has been something that we've been speculating behind the scenes as to why it has been such a quiet middle season Atlantic hurricane season. And a lot of it does, in fact, have to do with something as simple as overall upper and lower atmospheric stability. It's the same type of stability that we used to explore when forecasting for severe weather. If you have warm waters, warm air, unstable air down in the low levels with cool air over top of it, that is a recipe for instability and rising vertical velocities across the Atlantic. And as such, if you look at that chart there, it's a little difficult to see from this perspective. I'm not going to zoom into it because it is more or less just a bunch of sophisticated jargon, and I'm going to do my very best to break it down to you guys. Essentially, what all that red is showing is our upper tropospheric temperatures, as high as you can go in the atmosphere, the realistic weather observable atmosphere. The top portion of where weather is found, that fluid atmosphere that produces the weather we feel here on the surface, that is the top portion of that, and you can see where all that red is very, very not optimal, suboptimal temperatures that are very warm in nature. If you look at the line graph here on the right-hand side, I'll zoom into this, you can see overall our temperatures have just been warming atmospherically in the uppermost portions of the atmosphere as well, not just down at the surface. And I feel that that's a very simple parameter that we just did not take into consideration. We have such abnormal sea surface temperatures out there that maybe this is going to start to affect the overall atmospheric column. And when I say a term like column, that simply means in the vertical perspective from the sea surface all the way up to the top. Because naturally, when you think about it, what happens when you warm something up? It naturally emanates that warm radiation. It kind of just emanates off you. That's how you can see the human body on an infrared shot when you go through the airport or through a security detector. So now the working theory is, as the upper atmosphere warms to the highest extent it's ever been, really, will this come back down and actually start to produce a very, very back-ended hurricane season? Because we still will have some dynamics in place for tropical activity. We will still have the warm ocean waters. That's another thing too, folks, is y'all keep crying bust. Y'all keep getting on everyone's cases. We need named storms. We need some gangbuster-style major hurricanes. Dare I say it, we do. And I know someone out there is going to try to come after me in the comments, but again, before you manipulate my words, what I'm saying is these tropical low pressures that we know as hurricanes are what help to cycle all these very hot anomalies out of the waters, out of the deep ocean, subsurface waters, and out of the atmosphere. And I think what's actually happening is we've had certain areas of the Atlantic that just haven't seen a whole lot out of the tropics. We're starting to see that really extensive buildup of heat. And as a result, we're getting those vertical temperature profiles, whereas we want that lapse rate, that steep lapse rate that'll allow for rising motions and convection. And then naturally, you combine that with very bad wave breaking, the anticyclonic wave breaking that happens on the east side of those high pressure ridges, those clockwise rotations across the Atlantic. We just kind of have everything, unfortunately, working against us. And that's the truth of the matter, guys. Preseason forecasts, they're only so good. There's only so much skill, as a lot of the official sources, Phil himself, have mentioned that especially back in the likes of April, May, and June, you're only sitting at about 50-60% skill. And then by the time we're at that August perspective, that's when your skill goes up, but you still cannot forecast adequately. There's no computer model and no meteorological scientist on the face of the planet that can forecast these type of very minute and very brief, acute, if you will, like the medical conditions. You have chronic, long-lasting, acute, very short in duration. There's no real way to forecast these acute intra-season variables. And that's why, if you guys recall, way at the very beginning, we did do some preseason discussions, but I never wanted to talk named storms. I really I dislike the H word. It's been manipulated every which way possible, and I think that's also why, psychologically speaking, we have turned to hate this hurricane season. We have a lot of angry people out there, whether it be the general public, weather enthusiasts, tropical hobbyists, even other well-acclaimed meteorologists who are kind of just mad at this point that things have busted. So hyperactive, I'm going to say it once on this stream, and that's the only time you're going to hear that terminology out of me, it's probably not happening. At this point, I can very well see us ending at an average, if not an above average season, if we ever do get to unzip the Atlantic and allow it to produce a little bit to its fullest potential with all the other intra-season variables that we do have coming together towards the end of September and into October. So we shall see. To be determined. As you can see, we haven't talked about this, but La Niña has officially made its entrance. Climate Prediction Center has yet to actually classify us in a weak La Niña state, but we have officially dropped below that negative 0.5 degrees Charlie in our 3-4 region, and our 4, 3, and 1 and 2 are now well into that weak La Niña phase. So potentially this also could help our case for the Atlantic if we want to get a couple more named storms. I am confident we are not done with the hurricane season. We can very well still get a solid 5 to 10 named storms out of this hurricane season for sure. I'm erring more on the side of 5 to tell you the truth, just to remain on that conservative aspect until we can clearly see indications that the Atlantic is capable of producing hurricanes. But for the time being, it looks like we do slowly have our current background state trying to modify and give the tropics a bit of a boost, give it that little nudge that we love to eloquently say here on the channel. Here's a quick glance at that 3-4 index. You can see well into that negative 0.5 range, negative 0.54, which definitely does meet the criteria for La Niña, albeit weak. And I also, to backpedal just a little bit, do think we probably should have started to reevaluate all those H-active predictions at the start of the hurricane season when we did not verify our La Niña forecasts. There were a lot of us, including myself, who bought into those long-range climate model forecasts and CPC projections back in the likes of April, May, and June for La Niña. It wasn't until here internally on the Weather Center where we started to reassess whether or not we'd walk into a La Niña by the time July, August, and September roll around. We are just into the very initial days of September, and that weak La Niña is finally starting to creep in just a little bit. Will this play a huge role in our atmospheric layout? It could. Will it do us a ton of favors to supplement the weak basin that we've had up to this point? Probably not. We have other mechanisms in play here. With that being said, we're going to start to get ready to wrap up the live stream. There's a couple areas that I want us to pay attention to. I want us to continue to watch the Gulf of Mexico, and I want us to continue to watch the Western Caribbean, not just in the next couple of days, but as we go towards the very end of September, the rest of September, honestly, for all that matter. I'm just going to wrap in the entirety of September because we just don't know for certain. Our models, I think, are also very heavily struggling with these very weird atmospheric parameters on top of the very above average sea surface temperatures outside of the atmospheric parameters that they're trying to model. In layman's terms, they're just a little confused and they're trying to get their feet back underneath them like we are as meteorologists. I also do not want us to take our eyes off the greater main development region of the Atlantic because we do see signs that we could see a forecasted Kelvin wave propagate across the Atlantic, the northern hemispheric side, and help to try to stir up a little bit of tropical trouble. We just don't know when that will be. And in my personal opinion, looking at our velocity potential anomalies both here on the GFS, and I'll quickly click over to the Euro so you can see more or less a compare and contrast. They are both ebbing and flowing more or less on the same pattern. You can track where our Kelvin waves are going to be wandering through. There's a weak one that's expected to propagate in over the next couple of days, likely why we're starting to see our ensembles tick up in the main development region for that prospective fish storm. Then we have another area of convective coupled Kelvin wave activity, CCKW, Kelvin wave, however you want to describe it. Forgive me for using technically sophisticated terminology. I'm working on that. But essentially another mechanism in the upper levels that could sweep across the Atlantic and help to stir up a little bit of activity. And then down towards the very tail end of September into the almost the entirety of the first half of October, you can see a really nice propagation of our MJO. The MJO is separate of our Kelvin waves. Kelvin waves are more or less continuously rotating waves in the atmosphere right along the equator that mimic the same properties as the MJO. They're just smaller and shorter in duration, and they're emanated from the MJO, which is overall that big clustering of upward vertical motions that tend to help, if in the right phase, across the tropical Atlantic. If I switch switch on over to the European velocity potential, you can see the same thing. We have a weak Kelvin wave coming through, another weak indication here before we finally start to see the MJO rocking and rolling into those next favorable phases for the early half of October and the last 5 to 7 days of September. So I'm very cautiously, for the sake of not only the gig here, but as well as for you guys trying to rebuild that trust that I'm sure a lot of the weather community has lost, hyping up this hurricane season for the last several months now, I'm going to say that I'm confident that there will be a window of time for the Atlantic to produce tropical activity looking at the large scale. I'm not forecasting named storms. I'm not forecasting singular storms, but basing the parameters here, basing my forecast off the parameters that we have laid out in front of us, I really do see a window of opportunity for the Atlantic to try to get its act together. It will have the capabilities and the means brought on by some large-scale forcing. We're just going to have to wait and see and get to that point in time to see if there's other intricate variables in the background state of the atmosphere that will finally cooperate as well. As we've seen, these smaller ones have come back to bite us in the behind, even with the overall large-scale weather pattern looking conducive. The smaller crumbs on the table, if you will, are what's creating a larger mess in the grand scheme. So with that being said, guys, we're going to wrap up the live stream. Do I have any questions? You know, a nice little intimate group tonight. There really isn't much to talk about, and this I know is not one of my more frequently operating hours. I wanted to cram this live stream in post-working out of the studio today, so thank you very much, everybody, for joining me. And for those of you who may be new, once again, this is Channel 6 meteorologist David Nazario with your tropical update, and I look forward to producing not only bits and pieces of content here on the Weather Center, because we are not going anywhere, but as well as for our local viewers and folks who may want to tune in on YouTube and other social media platforms for the WKMG name from Channel 6 here in the greater Orlando area. So that's that, folks. Thank you very much for those of you who did take some time on your Wednesday evening to tune in. It's been a while since I've seen you guys. A lot going on. I am physically and mentally exhausted, but in a good way. This is what I was hoping for, and I'm so thankful that we're finally rocking and rolling with this opportunity, and there's still so much more to come regardless of what the tropics do, and I can't wait to unveil it all to you guys. So with that being said, I'm not seeing any questions popping up in the chat, so if you do have anything that comes to mind, feel free to drop me a comment in the comments section down below. I will always make it a case in point to hash out some time in my schedule to get back to you guys and address any questions, comments, or concerns you may have. Please consider clicking that like button, nudging that like button, and consider subscribing if you're brand new to the channel and the algorithm managed to push this channel to your homepage as a recommendation. I'd love to have you along for the ride, especially as we continue to refine the way we do our forecasting here on the Weather Center and over for our affiliates at WKMG, or I should say home base now over at WKMG. Mick and Marley, it rolls off the tongue. It rolls off the tongue, and I cannot wait to continue to produce content for you guys and Big Brother, the home base studio at WKMG. Oh, Scrooge McDuck, I'm very glad that you got to tune in for that. Mr. Man JJ Naz, what will the steering patterns be in October? Steering patterns are slowly but surely going to start going back out of the window, to tell you the truth, because as we get into October, not only will we be climatologically, wow, having a nervous breakdown on stream right now. Not only will we be fighting climatology as we roll through the bigger pieces of fall, but we won't have as much of that main development region activity. We'll start to have to focus back on towards the Caribbean, the Western Caribbean, and the Gulf of Mexico. And I do think we're going to have a couple of suspicious features we're going to have to keep a close eye out for and a close eye on as we get into the end of September and into early October. Remember, guys, it is only September 4th. When we're talking about an average hurricane season, your run-of-the-mill hurricane season, you take all the preseason jitters, jazz, psychology that a lot of folks out there, especially unofficial sources, have warped and manipulated for their own notoriety. If we're looking at just a generalized hurricane season, our next major hurricane typically occurs, our second. We've already had one. So we're technically still on par for a normal hurricane season. The next one typically occurs, statistically speaking, through history around September 17th to September 19th. That is when our second major hurricane tends to show up. So Despite the preseason allegations, we are still more or less right on schedule with a normal hurricane season. The reason why we're not looking at this as a normal hurricane season is because of all the craziness that unfolded back in April, May, and June, and that sick game of telephone I love to remind you guys of, coming down from the big official sources down to a lot of the YouTubers, and I call them the weather weenies out there, kind of twisting it and manipulating it. So, we'll see. Again, I definitely can still see an average, or if not above average, hurricane season unfolding between now and November. We'll just have to wait and see. There's definitely promising signs on the horizon, and there's definitely areas that I'm going to continue to monitor for, and that's about it. Just going to keep the clues, keep my magnifying glass on the models, on the real-time data, and I will get back to you very soon. If there are no questions in the chat, guys, it has been a pleasure, especially speaking to you under the new title. It is a phenomenal experience. It's been wonderful working and spinning up with the team. I'm not too sure if any of them are watching right now, but so far, even just being 48 hours in, technically 16, 17 hours in, it's already been phenomenal, and I'm so ecstatic to grow roots with everyone and start pumping out content, not only for the Weather Center, but with the team over at WKMG together working for you guys. Because that's the name of the game, you know. We forecast the weather. Our trade is weather forecasting and analysis, but we're here to serve the viewers and bring you guys the realistic, the accurate, and the safe weather coverage that you deserve. And that's exactly how I'm going to gear the Weather Center, particularly if you don't feel that I already have done so. I've tried my best. I'm really going to try to rein it in now and continue to practice and refine my own skills as a forecaster and a communicator for you guys, and a digital friend, if you will, because I know a lot of you have come from the humble beginnings of August of 2023, and we started out with 13 subscribers, and I couldn't have done this without you guys in my corner, and I sincerely attribute what I'm wearing for you guys today as a direct result of our relationship here in the streams, here on the content, and here on the channel, our community. So it's been an absolute pleasure, guys. I am officially talking to you from the other side, as weird and sci-fi that may sound, but you know what I mean. Thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. We will see you again soon. I'm not going to let you know when our next live stream is because, like I've mentioned previously, focusing on building my rapport and my relations and the content stream with WKMG, you can find me there. I am not leaving the weather community. I'm 110% knees deep and then some into the weather sphere at this point. I am here to stay. We are not going anywhere, guys. We just might be a little more latent here on the Weather Center particularly, but you can find us on the News 6 app, the News 6 YouTube, and all the News 6 social media. Weather 87, not someone more deserving than you, dude. Huge congrats. I really appreciate that. Fishmania as well. Congrats. It means a lot from you guys. And like I said, I do feel a large level of gratitude to you all for trusting me with your weather content even before this opportunity. It's been an absolute joy connecting and interacting with everybody, and I will not lose this community. I refuse. I want to take you guys with me and continue to keep up with everybody out there from every corner of the world, regardless of if you reside in Florida or not. I'm going to be looking out for every single one of you as best as I can with a spectacular team of seasoned forecasters in my corner, helping me do so and continuing to mentor and groom my skills as a meteorologist. So that's that, folks. Have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday night. We'll see you again soon, whether it be over on WKMG or here on the Weather Center. But you know what this is? This is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.